Hello, my name is Trayshawn Hunt, and I'll be presenting on the Iranian Revolution. The Iranian Revolution was a conflict of Muslim fundamentalism facing off against a secular regime led by the monarch Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. The main conflict was caused by the Shah's forced implementation of Western ideas and policies. The Shah's intent in implementing Western reform was to modernize Iran after it had been long war torn and occupied by Allied forces after World War II. Instead, the Shah's reforms failed in enabling the Iranian people into economic prosperity. His push for westernization either had his liberal opponents calling for him to step down to start a full democratization and secularization of Iran, or his fundamentalist Muslim foes calling for his abdication to start a theocracy led by the exiled Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Walkouts, sit-ins, demonstrations, and reading sessions were all done in protest to the Shah's oppressive regime. The five main causes of the Iranian Revolution was caused the Muslim fundamentalist revolt against the Shah's attempt at transforming Iran into a secularist nation that the Western powers would respect. The exile of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini after he was arrested and exiled from Iran in 1964, the failed reforms that the Shah introduced. These reforms were first praised and thought to have promise, but were not regulated thoroughly enough for the people to benefit. The growing governmental bureaucracy was also an issue because it further disallowed Iranian economic autonomy. The government hoarded financial resources at the top of the bureaucratic chain, and this enraged the Iranian people. Lastly, the opulence that the Shah displayed did not go over well with the public. I would like to start with the Muslim fundamentalist conflict in Iran. In 1941, the Shah's father, Reza Shah, was deposed. Then, after a British-Russian Allied forces invasion, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi was installed as the leader of Iran. He will follow in the footsteps of his father. His father, Reza Shah, also introduced many political, social, and economic reforms and opposed religion. Similar to his son, the discontent of Reza Shah's reign had the climate of a revolution. It would take 2 decades of failed prime ministers, generals, and American and British occupation before the Shah decided to rule on his own. With the assistance of the newly appointed and very subservient Prime Minister Asadullah Alam, the Shah tried to consolidate his power through an alliance with private landowners and the ulama. The ulama is Islamic elite ruling class. The ulama felt that modernization threatened their needs and even their existence in Iran. The traditional social forces claimed they were being imposed upon by the Shah's economic and cultural reforms that he was proposing. The leader of the ulama, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, saw the influence undermined by the Shah's modernization program and by giving women the right to vote. According to the traditional economic sector, the Bazaris, the reforms were a sign of intervention into their commercial activities, threatening the economic autonomy of the Bazar. After 2 years of vocal dissent and protest of the Iranian government, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini was arrested and exiled in Iran in November of 1964. Now let's discuss the failed reforms that were implemented by the Iranian government. The course of the Iranian Revolution took place between 1977 and 1979, but the events and the policies implemented that ignited the Iranian Revolution took place in the 1960s. In 1963, the White Revolution was launched, attempting to modernize and westernize Iran. 6 areas of reform were implemented. 13 would later be set in motion over the next 15 years. The 6 areas of reform include agricultural reform, the nationalization of Iran's forested and marginal areas, profit sharing for industrial workers, the sale of state-owned factories, female enfranchisement, and establishment of a literacy corps. The agricultural reforms involved the government purchasing land and selling it to farmers and agricultural laborers below purchase price. This reform was first viewed favorably as a progressive scheme to empower peasant workers. It worked out differently in practice. Landowners had a great deal over who maintained the plots. This allowed landowners to retain most fertile soil for themselves. This resulted in only 10% of peasants owning land, 2 to 2.5% of the agricultural production annually, and mass unemployment in the field of agriculture. The other reforms were partially carried out or their advancement was hindered by corruption. Iran's total production of labor maintained at a high level throughout the 1960s. This was largely because of the rising oil prices and Iran's exploitation of its oil resources. The Cultural White Revolution stalled, but the economy boomed with this robust oil industry. These oil profits helped establish an Iranian bureaucracy with a large public service center. The problem with this was that the allocation of funds was not distributed throughout all classes of people, increasing the income gap between the rich and the poor in Iran. The Shah did not reaffirm his legitimacy as a leader of the Iranian people after he had postured himself as a man of the people, creating reforms that appeared to be in favor of the peasant class. He proved that was all just a political power play. His display of arrogance was in further proof in 1967 when he allowed himself to be crowned. In 1971, the Shah, through a celebration for the 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire. A constant criticism was as the foreigners reveled in drink forbidden by Islam. Iranians were not only excluded from the festivities, some were starving. The first displays of public expression of social discontent against the regime took place in October of 1977. The German-Iranian Cultural Association in Tehran, Iran, hosted a series of reading sessions started by the Iranian Writers Association and the German Goethe Institute. In these 10 nights at Dashab, 57 of Iran's most prominent poets and writers read their works to thousands of listeners. They demand the end of censorship and claimed the freedom of expression. These demonstrations would continue into 1978. November witnessed multiple general strikes of the government facilities and private industries. Some of the largest marches took place in December of that year. An estimated 2 million protesters took part in demonstrations in Tehran during the Ashura festival. Soon after, demonstrations turned into full-on strikes. Some oil businesses and public administration services were so affected by the strikes that they ceased to operate. An employee at Iran's National Bank revealed that members of Iran's upper class had been transferring a lot of money to foreign banks. The elitist practices of the upper class no longer sat well with the protesters. The Shah was shocked that there were mass protests happening across Iran, especially in Tehran. His first action was to attempt to suppress the revolts and prevent them from developing further. The security forces were unprepared in dealing with protesters. Matter of fact, the security forces put forth by the Iranian government had not received any riot control training or new equipment since 1963. The security forces were ordered not to use excessive or deadly force on protesters. With their experience, they used excessive force anyway, prompting the Shah to officially condemn their actions. The protests continued undeterred as protesters continued to oppose the government with nonviolent protests. Over the following weeks, as the demonstrations took hold, those that had been killed were transformed into veritable martyrs. After 2 years of successful protests, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, or the Shah, fled Iran on January 16, 1979. Soon after, the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini was permitted to return to Iran after 15 years of exile. He arrived at the Tehran airport February 1st, 1979. March of that year, a referendum was voted to decide if Iran was to become an Islamic republic. The Islamic Republic of Iran was proclaimed April 1st of 1979, making Ayatollah Khomeini the supreme leader of Iran and also knowing the chance of opposition to rule. Now let's discuss the Iranian Revolution in relation to the theories of Chris Tilly, Dr. Martin Luther King, and Barbara Demings. Chris Tilly, in his book Trends, Variations, and Explanations, acknowledges that the 20th century visited collective violence on the world that more violence on the world than any century of the previous 10,000 years. He also writes that during the first half of the 20th century, massive interstate wars produced most of the world's political deaths, although deliberate efforts of the state authorities to eliminate, displace, and control subordinate groups also accounted for a significant number of fatalities. In Iran, their response to protesters involved armed police, cracking down on protesters, leading to numerous deaths. Many of Iran's citizens felt displaced by the government's implementation of Western policies. This left thousands unemployed and many fled the country. Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. protests incorporate nonviolent direct action. Direct action involves a person or a group of people proactively presenting themselves as they lay their case before the consciousness of the local and national community. This is what the Iranian students and laborers accomplished. They understood what they were fighting against, and they gathered together to express their grievances with the Iranian government. Barbara Deming's components of a nonviolent campaign include putting pressure on the antagonist, also putting your antagonist upon your antagonist two pressures: the pressure of our defiance of him and the pressure of our respect for his life. Barbara Deming's definition of direct action derives from Mahatma Gandhi's Satyagraha, which translates to clinging to the truth. Deming's definition of direct action is to cling to the truth as one sees it. The majority of these protests were Muslim. The Shah regime was attempting to modernize Iran to appeal to Western nations. The policies in place were favorable until they eventually did not meet expectations. Also, these policies drifted further away from Iran's Islamic identity, causing citizens to feel marginalized.